Benito Juárez, 1806 to 1872, 19th century Federalist politician and four-term president whose political career followed the development of young Mexico through the experience of civil war, foreign occupation, and economic transformation. Benito Juárez was born on March 21, 1806, in the Zapotec village of San Pablo Guelatao in the southeastern Mexican state of Oaxaca. By the time of his third birthday, his parents had died, and his grandparents, who took care of him after the death of his parents, passed away shortly thereafter. Early death was not uncommon in this Mexican region, where smallpox, yellow fever, and starvation often limited life expectancies. Finally, the boy moved to the household of his uncle Bernardino, for he was treated badly and given little care. Juárez contributed to his uncle's household by herding livestock, but his efforts to educate himself in the reading and writing of Spanish remained futile. At the age of 12, Benito Juárez decided to leave his uncle and move to the state capital of Oaxaca, where his sister was residing. He took up residence with Don Antonio Salanueva, a part-time bookbinder and lay member of a religious order, in exchange for servant services. This encounter changed his life because Don Antonio agreed to pay school tuition for him. 3 years later, in 1821, the year when Mexico gained independence from Spain, Juárez was able to leave school and enroll in the local seminary college, hoping to benefit from its superior instruction. Juárez approached adulthood at a time when Mexico's national political debates were turning into a power struggle between two hostile groups. On the one side stood the liberal Federalists who, according to Meyer and Sherman, considered themselves intellectual heirs of the French and American revolutions, students of the U.S. Constitution, and the liberal Spanish document of 1812. They were opposed by conservative centralists, who found their main support among the members of the Catholic Church, the military, and large landowners. After 1821, both groups struggled, often violently, to impose their political blueprints on the young Mexican state. Juárez experienced the consequences of this national struggle for the first time in 1827. That year, the anti-clerical Federalists won Oaxaca's state election and decided to open a secular college. Frustrated by the narrow scope of theological study, Juárez used the opportunity and enrolled in the civil college. For the next 6 years, he pursued the great secular alternative to the religious profession, the study of law. The national struggle, often complicated by threats of foreign intervention, affected him again in 1829. Then, he was named lieutenant in a regional civil militia corps that defended Oaxaca against a Spanish invasion force. Immediately after Juárez's graduation in 1831, his political career accelerated. On the local level, he served as an alderman. 2 years later, he moved on to the state level as a deputy to the Oaxacan state legislature. Most of his time, however, was devoted to his law practice. At the age of 37, he married the 17-year-old Doña Margarita Mazas in July of 1843. 1 year later, Juárez joined the state government of Oaxaca as secretary of the cabinet of Governor Don Antonio. The outbreak of the U.S.-Mexican War in 1846 found Juárez in Mexico City as a state delegate to the nation's constitutional assembly. After a rebellion in his home state, he was named provisional governor on November 23, 1847. This appointment was confirmed electorally the following year, when Juárez returned to Oaxaca as an elected governor of the state. The achievements of his tenure include the reorganization of the state's military forces, school reform, the realization of an ambitious infrastructure program, and the reduction of Oaxaca's debt. This success was critical for his later career. As historian Charles Smart states, if he had not accomplished so much in these years, and had been recognized later at a critical turning point in Mexican history for his achievements at the time, his rise to national stature and power might have been delayed. 1 year after leaving the governor's office in 1853, Juárez became the target of political persecution when the now centralist General Santa Anna reclaimed the Mexican presidency. As a former prominent Federalist governor, Juárez and other Federalists such as José María Mata, Ponciana Arriaga, and Melchor Ocampo were imprisoned by Santa Anna and eventually exiled to the United States. From New Orleans, the exiles continued their work against the dictator Santa Anna. First, they supported an uprising in the state of Guerrero with military supplies and propaganda material. In the summer of 1855, Juárez slipped back into Mexico and joined the rebellion as a political advisor. His political influence was felt with the publication of the manifesto of the Plan of Ayutla. Eventually, Other rebellions challenged Santa Anna successfully in the so-called Revolution of Ayutla. As Minister of Justice, Juarez joined the provisional Mexican administration that replaced Santa Anna's dictatorship. His path-breaking contribution to this governing body were radical reform laws which, for the first time, limited the special jurisdiction of military and ecclesiastical courts. Before the enactment of the Juarez laws, they had existed as a completely separate legal group within the state. Subsequent Federalist administrations continued this attack on the centralist political system. The efforts culminated in the publication of the new Mexican Constitution of 1857. It is no surprise that this federal attack on the centralists led to another violent confrontation. The period from 1858 to 1861 was later remembered as the War of the Reform. During its course, the Federalist government collapsed once again. Benito Juárez, now as Chief Justice of the Mexican Supreme Court, was constitutionally bound to assume the presidency. His position was immediately opposed, however, by centralist forces who rallied around rebellious army forces and members of the clergy. Consequently, Juárez was recognized as Mexican president by the Federalist camp only. Soon the Federalists were forced to abandon Mexico City and withdraw to Veracruz. There, control over customs receipts enabled them to continue purchasing arms and finance their government. Eventually, the Centralists were defeated, and Juárez re-entered Mexico City in the second week of January of 1861, as president of all the Mexicans. The Civil War had left Mexico more divided than ever before. Besides large-scale physical damage, the emotional and personal sufferings had torn apart the fabric of Mexican society more than in previous decades. Disagreements over how to deal with the defeated Centralists reached deep into the victorious Federalist camp, at times even threatening Juárez's position as president. To make matters worse, Mexico was bankrupt. Yet the Juárez government did not receive the necessary time to heal the wounds of the Mexican nation. European powers recognized Mexico's vulnerability as an opportunity to collect outstanding loans. President Juárez rejected European pressures and imposed a 2-year debt payment moratorium. But France, England, and Spain, meeting at the Convention of London, decided to enforce their demands with a temporary joint occupation of the Mexican Atlantic coastal range and the customs house of Veracruz. From the very beginning, France under Napoleon III had harbored larger designs on Mexico. Trying to revive the lost French colonial empire in the Americas, Napoleon III saw the temporary occupation of Veracruz only as a first step towards a complete takeover of the weak Mexican state. While Great Britain and Spain objected and eventually withdrew their forces, the French occupational forces proceeded towards Mexico City. The Juárez administration was able to halt the French advance temporarily. On May 5, 1862, French forces suffered a devastating defeat in the Battle of Puebla, an occasion that would later be commemorated as the national holiday Cinco de Mayo. But the French reinforcements were able to reverse the stalemate in Puebla. Conquering the city, they made Juárez's position in Mexico City undefendable. Eventually, the Juárez government was forced to withdraw to the U.S.-Mexican border near the town of El Paso del Norte, today known as Ciudad Juárez. Once again, Mexican centralists used the precarious situation of the retreating Federalists to realize their conservative political visions and searched Europe for a suitable European of royal blood to become their king. Instead, they were forced to accept Napoleon's preferred candidate, the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Habsburg. Subsequently, Maximilian and his wife Carlota arrived in Mexico to head a European-controlled monarchy. Maximilian and his French troops failed to dislodge Juárez's administration from El Paso del Norte, while Juárez's troops defended themselves successfully using guerrilla tactics. Moreover, the close proximity to the U.S. provided Juárez with a critical hinterland for supply and safe haven. At first, U.S. support remained weak due to the ongoing U.S. Civil War, but once the South was defeated, the U.S. administration, although officially neutral, backed the flow of military supplies from California and Louisiana to Juárez's troops. The French adventure in Mexico ended abruptly. When German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck's policies threatened France's security, the French forces in Mexico were suddenly needed to fortify France's European borders. The withdrawal of the French military allowed the Juárez government to take the offensive in 1866. Slowly, Federalist troops recaptured Mexican territory. Eventually, on February 18, 1867, the remaining French troops were defeated, and the dream of a French colonial European empire in Mexico collapsed. The Federalists had finally triumphed. Juárez immediately called for new presidential elections and ran as a candidate himself. He won the election easily in October of 1867. The most pressing national need was the reconstruction of the country that had been torn apart by civil war and the occupation of foreign forces. In the following years, the Juárez administration concentrated on the revitalization of the mining industry, the growth of commerce, and the completion of the critical railway link between the capital of Mexico City and the port of Veracruz, as well as the creation of a national state-run educational system. For the first time, Mexicans gained access to a free, secular primary education. At the same time, Juarez's national political reputation declined. After 3 terms in office, the voices became louder that demanded a change in the presidential office. Nevertheless, in 1871, Juarez ran for a 4th presidential term. In the following electoral campaign, he faced 2 former fellow Federalists, the hero of the Battle of Puebla, General Porfirio Diaz, and Sebastián Lerdo de Tejeda. When the election failed to produce 51% of the vote for either candidate, the Mexican Congress selected Juarez for a 4th term as president. Porfirio Diaz rebelled against the decision, but his revolt failed to bring about change. Before the tug-of-war between the aging president and his opponents could escalate, Juarez suffered a heart attack on July 19, 1872, and died in office. The national crisis was diffused. Following Juarez's death, Lerdo de Tejeda, Chief Justice of the Mexican Supreme Court, took over as acting president and won a newly scheduled election. In the following years, he continued Juarez's policy of modernization. After his death, the historical facts about Benito Juárez have turned into a powerful myth. According to historian Charles Weeks, the Juarez myth proved a way to express values as well as to disagree about them. Political canonizations expressed in statuary, popular and elitist art, school books, and commemorations all work to advance unity. To the extent that Mexicans agree about Juarez, he is the national symbol. His myth also points to the continuing search by a great people for an elusive identity.